Marissa Holt, a resolute black deputy director at the DEA, became the target of broad daylight humiliation when a white police officer pointed a gun at her at a gas station, simply because she didn't look like a federal authority. What seemed like a routine incident cracked open a buried truth about racial violence, political protection rackets, and lives quietly crushed by the system. Her honor, career, and courage were pushed to the brink, forcing her to make an impossible choice: stay silent to survive or rise up to drag an entire web of abuse into the light. What did one woman do that brought an entire system to its knees? Comment below where you're watching from, and stay tuned to the end to find out. The black SUV pulled into the Chevron station parking lot, engine gliding as smoothly as water against the curb. Its body gleamed, the rear bearing a government plate, U.S. Government, for official use only, just clear enough to catch attention, yet discreet enough to stir unease in eyes long trained by the town's unspoken order. The door opened. A black woman stepped out, tall frame, straight back, hair neatly tied in a bun at the nape. Her black suit fit precisely. Gray, low-heeled shoes tapped lightly against the cement. She neither glanced around nor offered a smile. Her eyes locked on the convenience store ahead, each step measured and assured, as if following a mental map she had long since memorized. Behind the windshield, an older woman sitting in a white SUV leaned toward her husband and whispered, "What kind of car did she just get out of? Looks like the FBI, doesn't it?" A young man stuffing a napkin into his collar to eat a sandwich in his silver pickup smirked and muttered to his friend, "First time I've seen a black lady in a suit at this station. What's she doing driving a government SUV?" Inside, behind the checkout counter, a long-haired clerk lowered his hand from a half-finished drink, squinting. "Is she like a regional supervisor or something? Looks like an inspector." Marissa paid no mind to the stray whispers. She walked straight to the coffee station, pulled a medium paper cup, and pressed the nozzle, filling it with a stream of thick black coffee. The scent of hand-roasted beans drifted through the mix of gasoline and peppermint that lingered in the store. Her left hand held the lid, her right poured, each motion deliberate, practiced, not rushed, but firm, like someone who'd built morning ritual into habit. As she stepped to the counter, the cashier's eyes caught the badge clipped to her belt, Deputy Administrator, DEA, printed in dull silver on a black background. He said nothing, scanned the cup, only the register's beep breaking the silence. Marissa took the coffee and walked out, her reflection flashing across the glass. Neat, composed, her steps landing like the bricks beneath had been laid just for her shoes. Her hand had barely touched the car door handle when the air shifted, punctuated by the sharp screech of tires and the thud of a police cruiser skidding hard across sun-warmed asphalt. The car surged in from the right, parking with the urgency of chasing a fleeing suspect. Sparrows scattered from the lamp post, the door flung open, and from the driver's seat emerged a tall man in a county police uniform, cropped hair, silver-rimmed sunglasses. His right hand rested on his holster, his gait heavy with the entitlement of someone used to commanding order. His eyes scanned the license plate, then locked onto the woman in front of him. No smile, no sign of courtesy. "This is your vehicle." The tone sharp, like an order. Marissa didn't move. The coffee cup stayed steady in her right hand, her index finger subtly tightening. She looked directly at him, her head tilting slightly, her gaze calm and clear, as if the question was both incomplete and unnecessary. A hot gust swept through, carrying with it the creak of tree sap and something unsettled in the air. In a town more used to seeing black people in orange jumpsuits than tailored black suits, Marissa Holt's presence wasn't just unusual. It was a challenge, one that demanded an immediate decision: resist or control. And Reddick, the officer standing before her, had just chosen the latter. Marissa remained still, coffee cup in hand, her gaze steady as she replied, "The vehicle is under my authority," she said, her voice low, firm, and resolute. "Deputy Administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration, Holt, Marissa Holt." But hearing the title didn't faze Carter Reddick, the officer who had stepped out of the cruiser. If anything, his face tightened slightly, as though suppressing a smirk. His right hand still hovered near his holster as he took half a step closer, slow but deliberate, narrowing the space with the quiet threat that comes from habit. "Deputy Administrator, huh?" he sneered. "Nice. Folks are making some real slick fake badges these days. Throw on a suit and think you belong on Capitol Hill." Marissa tilted her head, her eyes sharpening for a beat. She didn't respond to the jab right away. Instead, she glanced at the badge clipped to her belt, then back at Reddick, as if silently questioning how often a county cop had dared to tell a federal officer to her face that her credentials were fake. "So, let me ask," she said slowly, "in all the encounters you've had, how many people do you think are dumb enough to carry a fake badge, drive a government car, and announce a federal title in full view of security cameras?" Reddick didn't answer. The question wasn't meant for a reply. It was meant to remind him exactly where he stood, a man losing control while pretending to hold authority. "Or," Marissa continued, her tone still oddly composed, "maybe you've just never met a black woman in a position high enough to make you question your entire sense of reality." Reddick's sunglasses stayed fixed on her. His hand grazed the radio mic on his left shoulder, but he didn't press the button. "You got the keys to this car?" he asked, his eyes darting to her jacket pocket. "Or is it your husband's? Ex-boyfriend's, maybe?" The final line dropped like baited provocation. No curses, no slurs, but the tone was heavy with condescension, as if ownership, presence, and access to federal resources were luxuries disqualified by her skin. Marissa gently set the coffee at her feet, straightened up, and tugged slightly on the edge of her coat, revealing the inner pocket. "I have an internal ID, a Level 4 access credential, and a federally verified appointment letter," she said, "all in the left inside pocket. I'll show you when you stop asking pointless questions." Her voice lowered on that last phrase. The precision in her wording landed like a quiet rebuke, one that revealed more than it accused, leaving no room to counter. Reddick licked his lips, his eyes narrowing. He leaned back, not in retreat, but shifting his stance to favor his dominant side. The gun at his hip moved with him. Then came the barked command, clipped and cold. "Keep your hand away from your jacket." Now Marissa stayed still. Her eyes were no longer trying to defuse. They were reading, analyzing, as though Reddick had just crossed a line she had promised herself no one would ever be allowed to cross. "I've clearly stated where my documents are. I've also made it clear I'm on official duty," she said, her voice quieter but now carrying a razor's edge, sharp enough to scrape glass. "I haven't refused cooperation. The only thing I see here is a local officer issuing repeated demands without cause, despite clear on-site verification, including a government license plate, security cameras, and federal credentials." Reddick either didn't hear or didn't care. He stepped back half a pace, his palm sliding down to the grip of his weapon with the programmed ease of muscle memory. In the dry heat, rising off the pale concrete, the click of the safety disengaging snapped through the air, sharp and brittle, slicing through the illusion of calm like a blade. The sound froze Marissa. It froze the entire gas station. A young Asian boy near Pump 3 whipped his head around, eyes wide, his hand dropping the game phone he had been holding. He looked to his mother, a Korean woman rifling through the trunk, who froze at the sight of the drawn weapon. She pulled her son close, whispered something, and took 2 quick steps back. "How do you go to work and end up with a gun pointed at you?" A man nearby muttered, his eyes locked on the scene like it was a daytime drama, not something unfolding right beside him. Inside the convenience store, the young cashier, who just minutes earlier had watched Marissa with mild suspicion, now leaned against the counter, phone up, recording. His ear pressed to the glass, he whispered, "What the hell's going on? It's barely morning." A group of 3 teens in hoodies near the ice machine giggled. One said, "That lady's gonna go viral. Look at that stone face." Another chimed in, "Bet we'll get mad views. Just film the whole thing." They stood just a few feet from Marissa, separated only by faded parking lines, but none moved closer, and not one thought to dial a civil response line. Meanwhile, between Reddick and Marissa, the tension continued to climb. "Turn and face the car." Reddick's voice was flat, cold as metal, rigid as handcuffs. Marissa raised an eyebrow, barely, her face loosened slightly, lips tightening as if silently wondering, how is this still happening? After all the decades of marches, protests, legislation, "I will comply for both our safety," she said, eyes fixed on the reflection in the car window, where she could see the gun pointed at her back. "But I suggest you consider the consequences when this is brought before the Department of Justice." Then, as if sealing the endgame of a long, tense match, Marissa bent down to set her coffee cup on the ground. In a split second, the cup tilted and slipped from her fingers. Dark liquid splattered across the concrete, spreading into a damp blotch on the pale gray surface. The rising heat from the cement mingled with the scent of coffee, creating a faint, burnt aroma, an odd kind of smell for a morning that wasn't quite a nightmare, but had long left behind any sense of peace. She let the empty cup drop beside her foot, then slowly turned around. Her movements were deliberate, not rushed, not flustered, controlled without shrinking. Marissa placed her hand on the hood of the car. The metal had absorbed the full weight of the morning sun. The heat stung her skin, like the touch of a warm iron pressing against the back of her hand. She leaned her forehead gently on the car's frame, eyes closing for a few seconds, granting herself one deep breath before bracing for the worst. Disdainful stares, whispers, camera phones raised, laughter from some distant, shaded corner, and they came quicker than she expected. "Impersonating a federal officer, huh?" Reddick raised his voice, clearly projecting for the impromptu audience gathering around the gas station. "I've seen this trick plenty of times. Dress sharp, wear a badge, drive a government car, but it's all a con in the end." He circled to Marissa's right side, gun still firmly in hand, eyes peering into the vehicle. His voice dropped to a growl. "You people love a performance. Put on the intellectual act, all polished and righteous, but it's fake. I see folks like you here every damn week." Each phrase landed like a hammer on stone, loud enough to pull eyes from every corner. There were no explicit slurs, no direct insults, but the message was loaded, about her race, her gender, and her audacity to stand there in power. Marissa heard every word quietly, as if engraving them into memory, knowing that sometimes just existing with dignity could be twisted into a crime. In the slanted southern sunlight, she became acutely aware of herself, not just as a federal officer at the peak of a hard-earned career, but as someone who could never fully escape the outdated image society had crafted for people like her. Default suspicion, interrogating eyes, and a shame that needed no words. Her shadow stretched long across the pavement, merging with the silhouette of a man holding a gun and the many others standing nearby, filming or watching in silence but not stepping forward. The young Asian boy still gripped his phone, lens pointed at Marissa, but unlike the adults around him, his eyes weren't amused or curious. They were wide, confused, as if trying to understand why someone who looked like the law professor from a Netflix show was being treated this way. "Mom," he whispered. She didn't do anything. His mother, face pale, placed a hand gently on his shoulder and tightened her grip, her gaze fixed on Reddick's gun. She didn't answer him directly, only murmured, "Don't speak, just keep filming, for proof." The boy nodded, lifted his phone closer, and began recording the image of a black woman with her hand on the car's hood, her posture straight, her head slightly bowed, eyes shut like she was bracing for a final blow. Across the lot, a white man leaned against a battered Dodge, watching Marissa for a long time. "Another one," he muttered to himself. "These people never learn, always looking for trouble." And it was true. In that space, even though Marissa was alive and breathing, most of the people around her had already made their choice. Avoid trouble, stay silent, capture the footage, post it later, maybe comment that this doesn't look right. But no one would step in. She understood, and that was the most painful part. Under the intensifying sun, the scent of spilled coffee mixed with body heat and melting plastic to create a kind of air that defied description. It was no longer the normal quiet of a late morning. It had turned into a scene of violence without blood, where the victim was carved apart piece by prejudice, by stares, by silence. And as the gun remained trained on her, Marissa's eyes began to trace the reflections on the car's hood. She saw her face, the weapon, Reddick behind her, and the dozens of tiny lenses capturing it all, yet not a single eye truly seeing. They saw a black woman, but she saw a society replaying a wound that had never healed. The black SUV remained still under the sun, its shadow stretching long like a cut across the pavement toward the far wall of the gas station. Marissa stood exactly as she had been, both hands resting on the scorching hood. Behind her, the sound of Reddick's boots scraped low and deliberate against the ground, each step ringing like metal striking tension. He approached quickly and with precision, as if every move had been drilled into him, but proceeded to ignore every rule of protocol. Without a word, he bent down and reached into Marissa's coat pocket, rifling through it like she was just another low-level suspect on the street. No request, no explanation, no justification. His fingers found her keys, the jingle of metal brief and jarring. He yanked the set out as if he'd just secured the final piece of incriminating evidence. Then, continuing the performance he had baited the crowd into watching, Reddick moved toward the driver's door and unlocked it with deliberate force. The door swung open, revealing a clean, organized federal vehicle. A laptop was mounted on a charging dock in the front passenger seat. In the glove box, a thin folder sat next to DEA-branded documents sealed with official tabs, and a large internal ID badge adhered to the dashboard, clearly displaying the DEA insignia and the name Marissa Holt, Deputy Administrator. A QR code glittered in the sunlight on the corner, but Reddick ignored all of it. He leaned deeper into the car, muttering with a smirk, probably borrowed this laptop from the public library. He laughed to himself, then straightened up and turned to the onlookers. Near the ice machine, someone started walking closer. The white man by the old Dodge stepped forward. He chewed gum slowly, each grind of his jaw deliberate, like he was crushing something in his mouth. That was Troy Bellman, owner of the lawnmower repair shop 3 blocks away. Everyone in Spartanburg had heard stories about him, yelling at customers for speaking Spanish in America, or refusing to hire a black teen because you're not the kind my machines understand. Troy moved in, his eyes scanning Marissa with a mix of contempt and pleasure, like a favorite show was finally being played live. He let out a mocking whistle and said loud enough for all to hear, "So now all it takes is a suit and a government logo to call yourself an agent?" He tilted his head toward Reddick. "Officer, don't let her fool you. I swear, black folks are getting slick these days. Think if their shoes are shined, they can walk all over us." He stepped closer, peeked into Marissa's car, and nodded. "Look at that. Nameplate and all. Seen this scam all over Facebook groups. There's a whole club of Socialjustice fakes. Cracks me up every time." He burst out laughing, the dry sound echoing across the now crowded gas station. A woman, pushing a stroller nearby, glanced back and forth between Marisa and the gun still in Reddick's hand, her grip tightening on the handle as she slowed, just enough to hear. Reddick heard Troy's comments, and for the first time since arriving, he laughed too. Not loudly, but with an ease and confidence that hadn't been there before, as if having a cosigner made absurdity feel justified. Marisa, still motionless with her hands on the hood, heard every word. The insults no longer felt personal. They carried the weight of a system she had confronted all her life. She inhaled deeply, her fingers pressing slightly harder against the burning metal. Instead of responding, she looked down at the concrete, where sunlight cast Troy's shadow flailing like part of a ridiculous show. She knew his kind, men who didn't insult because they understood justice, but because they hated seeing someone like her rise beyond the limits they had quietly assigned. They shouted to drown their insecurity. They needed someone to step on so they could feel tall. Marisa bit her lip, disgusted by a society that allowed ignorance to become a mouthpiece for truth, simply because it shared a skin tone with the man holding the gun. Among the chatter, the snickers, and the phones aimed her way, Marisa said nothing, but her eyes no longer looked at Reddick or Troy. They gazed into the distance, toward the place where justice should have stood, because she knew, while they joked and filmed and felt entertained, there was a boy, his hands still gripping the phone, his eyes unblinking, silently recording the truth he would one day need to remind the world, that prejudice, no matter how cleverly disguised, remains a stain that cannot be washed away. Reddick stood in the middle of the gas station like the lead actor in a play he'd written for himself, the gun in his hand no longer a tool of defense, but a symbol of the power he was desperate to assert under the eyes of the crowd. The more people gathered, the louder he became. The more Troy laughed, the more eager he was to perform. "Who do you think you are?" Reddick barked, raising his voice with theatrical flair. "Flash a couple of badges, throw an old laptop in your car, and suddenly you're a federal agent?" Marisa remained still, hands on the hood, her dark hair pulled into a bun, casting a shadow down her neck. The sun was sharper now, cutting across her shoulders like blades of light. Hot, exhausted, but unmoving, she knew any gesture, even adjusting her sleeve, could be read as a threat, because the gun was still pointed at her, and the man holding it was drunk on authority. What Reddick didn't realize was that every moment, every image and sound from Marisa's vehicle's front and rear cameras, every bit of data from the DEA's onboard system, was already being streamed live to federal headquarters through an encrypted emergency link. She didn't need to pull out a phone. The car had done it for her the moment Reddick approached. And that's why no one at the station was prepared for the sound of tires screeching from a distance, slicing through the thick, uneasy air like an arrow. A black SUV, identical to Marisa's but without government plates, braked hard near Pump 5. The door flew open with sharp precision. The first to step out was a woman, fit and tall, level in height with Reddick, her long hair tied low at the back. Her black suit flowed as she moved, each step purposeful. It was Special Agent Elena Vargas. Elena raised her badge on a lanyard, her voice ringing out like a church bell. "Federal agent. She's my superior. Lower your weapon now." Reddick spun around. Behind the dark lenses of his sunglasses, there was a beat of hesitation, then a squint of suspicion. He glanced at her badge, then at her tanned face and tightly pressed lips, her skin tone, the faint trace of Spanish in her accent. He discounted her immediately. He didn't see rank, he only saw color. "Elena, whatever. I'm handling a serious impersonation case. You need to step back. This doesn't concern you." Elena froze, fury flashing in her eyes, but before she could respond, the rear door of the SUV opened, and from its shadow stepped a white man, just past 50, slender in build but radiating a presence that demanded silence. Black suit, charcoal shirt, plain tie, and a badge clipped to his chest like a quiet warning. He walked straight toward Reddick, each step calm and weighted, the kind that silences rooms with nothing but presence. Federal Tactical Director Gavin Mercer. Gavin didn't need to repeat himself. He stopped in front of Marissa's car, swept the scene with a single glance, from the drawn gun to the phones raised by shaken civilians, and finally to Reddick's flushed face. His voice was deep, every syllable sharp. "Lower your weapon. Now she is my superior." The words cracked through the midday heat like thunder. No one reacted fast enough. No one had expected that the woman held at gunpoint, the one surrounded by suspicion, was the person with authority over the very agents now entering the scene. Time froze. Troy's jaw dropped. His gum hung between clenched teeth. The woman with the stroller quietly backed away. The young Asian boy filming kept his eyes wide, his grip tightening around the phone. Reddick stiffened. His hand faltered on the gun. He looked at Gavin, then Elena, turned to Marisa, the woman he had mocked, accused, threatened, and now stared at like the very air around him had betrayed him with a truth he couldn't undo. Marisa remained silent. Reddick's gaze darted around, lost. The people he thought were on his side now backed away, as if fearing association. At that moment, in a suburban parking lot, the balance of power flipped, and the officer who thought he held control finally realized he had picked the wrong woman to challenge. The gas station stood frozen in taut silence. All the ordinary sounds, fuel pumping, ceiling fans spinning above the awning, engines humming along the highway, seemed swallowed by the pressure building at the center of it all. And there, in the eye of the storm, Carter Reddick remained locked in position, feet planted on hot concrete, right arm extended, his Glock 22 aimed squarely at the back of Marissa's head. The sun angled in just enough to cast the weapon's shadow down her spine, a threat both visible and cruel in its clarity. Reddick's face twisted. Sweat trickled from his temple, ran down the bridge of his nose, and landed on his lips. He bit his lower lip, his eyes flicking between Gavin, the man whose voice had just silenced an entire scene, and Marisa, the woman who hadn't resisted, hadn't spoken, but whose silence made him feel smaller with every passing second. Director Gavin Mercer stood firm like a pillar in a storm. No hand-raising, no shouting. He repeated the same command, this time lower, slower, and forged from steel. "Lower your weapon, officer. Disarm. This is a federal order." Not a word wasted. Each syllable struck the boiling pavement like nails hammered in. The air itself seemed to be still. All eyes locked on Reddick's hand, and the index finger curling just slightly more than it should. Reddick's breathing grew shallow. His face paled. He gripped the weapon like a lifeline, as if that trigger were the last thread holding his dignity. In his eyes, now was no logic, just raw instinct, screaming that surrender meant total collapse, of authority, of control, and most of all, of an ego long built on commanding others into submission. In his world, Marisa was never supposed to hold this rank, let alone receive deference from someone like Gavin. He had already constructed his truth, that the black woman before him was a fraud, that the suit was a disguise, that the government car might be stolen. Accepting Gavin's word meant shattering the script he had written for his audience. Gavin knew this. He also knew that a second more, one unconscious twitch of a finger, could unleash a tragedy that no one could undo. Silently, Gavin raised his left hand behind his back. The two federal agents in black suits flanking him understood immediately. They fanned out in a quiet arc, closing in like steel jaws. One rested his hand near his coat hem, ready to draw. The other advanced into Reddick's blind spot. In the polished surface of the car, Marisa saw it all. She didn't turn. She didn't flinch. She simply breathed, kept her neck upright, palms flat on hot metal, her body a fixed point in the center of the storm. She could still feel the gun's presence, but Gavin's composure, the agent's movement, and the precision of it all told her the situation was controlled, even if just barely. "Carter Reddick," Gavin said, this time using both names. His voice didn't rise, but somehow it struck harder. Reddick twitched. "You are pointing a weapon at a federal officer. She is the deputy administrator of the DEA. Every action you've taken, drawing your weapon, searching a federal vehicle, refusing to verify official ID, has been recorded by the central surveillance system. We've had a direct signal from the dashcam feed since the start. This case is already with the Department of Justice." Reddick's face was drained of color, shifting from red to gray. "You're putting your career, your name, and someone else's life on the line for your pride," Gavin continued. "Put the gun down. This is your final chance." Reddick's hand trembled. His finger inched closer to the trigger, an instinctive recoil of fear and refusal. But, with the agents now less than 3 strides away, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. If he pulled, he would be the first to fall. Troy Bellman, who had hung around hoping to cheer or provoke, now paled. He swallowed hard and began to back away. When one of the agents glanced in his direction, Troy dipped his head, turned, and slipped between rows of cars like a rat catching the scent of a trap. Reddick, damp with sweat, panting, finally muttered a brittle phrase. "I was doing my job. I had reasonable suspicion." But the words landed like air through a hollow pipe, thin, weightless, meaningless. Gavin didn't reply right away. He tilted his head, eyes cold as glass. "You had every opportunity to follow procedure. Instead, you chose your weapon. And now no one remembers your suspicion. They only remember you raised a gun at a federal agent in the line of duty." At last, Reddick pulled his hand away from the trigger. His arm dropped, the weapon still in hand but no longer threatening. His breathing was jagged. His spine bent forward, as if he'd just run too far across a line he hadn't even realized he'd crossed. Reddick stood motionless in the middle of the parking lot, sweat pouring from his brow, soaking the collar of his shirt. The hand that had held the gun now trembled visibly, not from tension, but from the complete collapse of a position he had once believed unshakable. The power he thought permanent, the power to command, to intimidate, to define the lines between justice and guilt, had been stripped away in less than a minute, undone by a black woman he had never imagined he'd need to answer to. Gavin remained where he was, spine straight as a steel bar. The 2 agents behind him hadn't needed to draw their weapons. They simply stood there, their presence etched into the moment like a verdict. Reddick's performance was over. His finger slipped from the grip. The Glock clattered onto the concrete with a sharp metallic crack, the sound ringing out like a slap to his face. Under the still gaze of the crowd, Reddick dropped to one knee, his left hitting the ground first, both hands raised in a gesture that landed somewhere between surrender and desperation. I'm sorry," he panted, voice fractured. "I didn't know. I suspected. I didn't mean to." Gavin didn't move. His voice cut through the air, deep and unflinching, like a mirror angled toward the crumbling remains of Reddick's pride. "I'm not the one you owe an apology to." That single line drained whatever was left in Reddick. He turned slowly, his eyes red, not just from shame, but from the panic of being exposed. He looked toward Marisa. She was now turning to face him, her hands no longer on the hood. Her collar was darkened with sweat, her left sleeve smudged with fuel dust. She bent down to pick up the discarded coffee cup, lifted it, and dropped it gently into the trash bin by the pump. Even that simple act carried the composure of someone who didn't have to shout for justice, because it followed her on its own. Marisa turned fully, standing face to face with the man kneeling before her. Her eyes held no rage, no screaming, but their depth, quiet and steady as a well, left nowhere to hide. "I came here for coffee," she said, clear and firm. "What did you see in me that made you draw your weapon?" Silence gripped the station. No one laughed. No one made excuses, not even those who had cheered, filmed, or whispered earlier. Troy, the man who'd flung insults so easily, was nowhere to be seen. A store clerk murmured into his radio. Plaid shirt guy ran off, slipped through the alley. Only one voice rose, a woman standing near the ice machine. Her hair hung to her shoulders, held back by a faded silver clip. Her eyes shimmered, and when she spoke, her voice trembled like wind scraping against a bruised heart. "I have a daughter your age," she said, looking directly at Marisa. "If this had happened to her, I wouldn't be able to sleep." Those words, quiet and few, triggered a ripple across the crowd. Eyes turned toward Marisa, not in doubt, but in realization. Marisa exhaled softly. She looked to Gavin, then took one step toward Reddick, still kneeling, head down like a man awaiting judgment. But she didn't speak again. She didn't reach out. She gave him no out, because what needed to be done was already clear. Her voice rang out, firm as a knuckle on the door of justice. "Cuff this officer. Charge abuse of authority and endangering the life of a federal agent." Gavin nodded once. The two agents stepped forward without a word, lifting Reddick to his feet. The metallic snap of handcuffs echoed beneath the noon sky of Spartanburg. As he was led away, his head hung low, each step falling hard on the pavement, where he had once shouted down a woman for the audacity to be confident, to step out of a government vehicle with her head held high. The stain on Marisa's suit could be washed, the coffee could be replaced, but Reddick's honor, fallen onto that concrete before so many eyes, would never return whole. And that was the price of drawing a gun from prejudice, not principle. The sight of Reddick in handcuffs, marched away beneath the midday sun, struck the gas station like a slap to the face. Some who had been watching since the beginning turned away. Others remained frozen, as if a mask had just been ripped from someone they thought they knew. But for Marisa, this was only the beginning. She stood with both hands now freed from the blistering car, her shoulders squared, suit still dusted with grit, but her face razor-sharp in focus. The anger was gone from her eyes. What remained was surgical precision, cold as a scalpel slicing through deceit. She stepped closer to Gavin, motioning for him to lean away from public earshot. Her voice was low, but it struck like steel. A man like Reddick doesn't pull a gun in broad daylight on a federal agent and still think he's in the right, unless he's done it before and been protected. Gavin gave a slight nod. "We have rapid access clearance to the county PD's internal database." "Do it," Marisa said. "I want his record. I want to know what he's done and why he's never been suspended." Gavin didn't question her. He turned, pulled out his official device, and contacted Federal Data Control directly. The agent beside him opened a laptop, authenticated the access code, and began typing rapidly, his fingers tense, as if piloting a chopper through a storm. Within 3 minutes, the screen filled with records, and what poured onto it left both Marisa and Gavin locked in grim silence. 3 use-of-force complaints, all involving black women. The first, a high school teacher, face slammed against the hood for ignoring a traffic signal, case closed in 10 days. The second, a medical student, yanked from her car at 2 a.m., shoulder dislocated, unable to finish her clinical exam, case dismissed due to noncompliance. The third, crueler still, a 6-month pregnant woman, forced to sit on a frozen curb in December after being suspected of stealing her husband's car. She miscarried 2 days later. No internal probe. Record noted. Insufficient evidence of direct causation. Marisa read each line as if every word etched itself into her bones. After a breath, she said quietly, 3 women, 3 lives, and he's still in uniform. still carrying a weapon, not a scratch on his annual evaluations. Gavin's gaze dropped, heavy with the weight of a broken system. Then another figure stepped forward, Evan Turner, the DEA's regional legal counsel. Lean, sharp-featured, his demeanor was like someone who just stepped out of a brutal hearing. He leaned in close and murmured to Marisa, "We tried to intervene last year, after receiving a joint complaint from local citizens," Evans said. The case was withdrawn almost immediately. The state inspector general wouldn't touch it. "Why?" Marisa asked, voice tight but calm. Evan glanced around, then spoke as if slicing through darkness. "He's connected. Reddick's family has deep ties to State Senator Richard Alton. His mother was a legislative aide. His father's a former county police chief. Every time he screws up, one phone call, and the internal reports vanish, labeled inconclusive." Marisa gave a cold laugh, not of amusement, but the bitter kind that comes when the system refuses to admit its own decay. "So we're looking at a man propped up by blood and politics," she said, her eyes flashing with a light only those who've tasted institutional betrayal truly recognize. Someone raised in legacy privilege, using a badge to patch over his insecurity, and seeing every black person as a personal threat. Evan nodded, squinting. He was once recommended for supervisory leave, blocked directly by the senator's office. Gavin stared at the screen. He didn't speak, but his hands tightened, knuckles whitening. "We take this all the way," Marisa said, her voice now half command, half oath. "No more collateral damage for a man in uniform who's rotten at the core." She looked around the gas station. An hour ago, people filmed her like a criminal. Now the air hung quiet, like an open-air courtroom. Some were beginning to understand what they'd just witnessed. Some still looked unsure, but the truth had already surfaced. Reddick, the officer so many once trusted, once viewed as a symbol of order, was now exposed as a polished product of institutional protection, a man cloaked in power and impunity while using the law as a shield to crush it. And now, the black woman he had dismissed as a fraud was the one stripping away that mask. Within an hour of Marisa being confirmed as the deputy administrator of the DEA, video footage of her having a gun pointed at her head had already flooded every major platform, spreading like wildfire in dry wind. Every shaky phone angle from bystanders, each dash cam snippet capturing the threats and the forced compliance of a high-ranking federal agent under a scorching noon sun, all came together to paint a chilling, unfiltered portrait that left millions stunned. Community forums, legal networks, veterans groups, and academic circles quickly mobilized. People began to hail Marisa as the embodiment of composure, a symbol of black womanhood confronting systemic violence with unwavering poise. Social feeds overflowed. The look in Marisa's eyes was enough to shame the system. "If there's one woman I'd want my daughter to model herself after, it's her. Her calm is the most powerful and most heartbreaking thing I've seen this year." But almost as predictably as gravity, counterattacks from far-right circles began to surface. They didn't just deny what thousands had witnessed, they started dissecting Marisa's personal life, as if trying to frame her as the real criminal. On an anonymous forum, a newly created account posted an article titled, "The Woman Claiming to Be an Agent. Who is she really?" The post featured a photo from the funeral of Marisa's husband, a veteran killed in Kandahar in 2018, with a caption that read, "Husband died a hero. Wife lives like an actress. Maybe she's used to staging emotional scenes." Not long after, a right-leaning YouTube channel posted a video dripping with sarcasm. The new victim type, no tears, no screams, no panic, just frozen like a statue. Is that fear, or someone who knows she's on camera? The comments came in like a swarm. "She's probably rehearsed this. A black woman speaking too clearly? That's suspicious. Why wasn't she trembling? No one takes a gun to the head and keeps perfect eyeliner. Marissa, who had stared down the barrel of a gun not long before, now found herself in the middle of a different kind of war, one invisible, but just as vicious. Here, no one was aiming at her head, but at her dignity, her credibility, her right to be believed. She sat alone in a temporary DEA office, the yellow desk light casting shadows over files she hadn't had time to close. Her computer screen pinged constantly with alerts from major news outlets, MSNBC, The Hill, The Washington Post, CNN, even political podcasts all wanted a quote, a sound bite, a tear, a headline grabbing expression. She didn't respond. Instead, she played the video taken from the young Asian boy's angle, the one where she stood still in the gas station lot, the gun hanging behind her head, her gaze calm as if carved from stone. Gavin entered, holding his phone still open to a trending article. DEA deputy or Hollywood lead. He set it on the desk, his eyes lowered slightly. They're rewriting the story. A woman who didn't break is suddenly a threat. Marissa didn't respond right away. She stared at the screen. In that moment, she found herself wondering if she had screamed, flailed, cried, would people have believed her more easily? Maybe they would have found her pain more convincing, because that's the image they've been conditioned to accept. Victims should be fragile, vulnerable, visibly broken. After a long pause, she spoke softly. When black people stay calm, they're called cold. When we cry, we're called weak. When we react, we're called angry. So, who is the ideal victim this society wants? Gavin nodded slowly. He looked at her like a man who had read 100 cases distorted by prejudice. But never before had he seen one woman's silence cause an entire system to waver. Meanwhile, in a middle school on the north side of the city, Zora, Marissa's 12-year-old daughter, stood in a hallway as a crumpled piece of paper passed hand to hand. On it was a printed image of her mother with a gun to her head, scribbled over with mockery. A few kids giggled. Zora simply took the paper, folded it neatly, and slipped it into her pocket. After hours of non-stop debriefings, a flood of news alerts, some praising, some mocking, every outlet dissecting each frame of her ordeal like a forensic cross-examination, Marissa returned home just after sunset. The house still held its usual warmth, but something in the living room air felt different. Everything seemed tidier than usual, too orderly, like Zora had tried to clean up, hoping it might ease her mother's tension. On the dining table sat a box of cold pizza, half-eaten slices pushed to one side with an effort too precise for a typically messy 12-year-old. Marissa walked upstairs, passed by her daughter's room, and saw the door slightly ajar. She was about to step in, but paused when she caught Zora's reflection in the mirror. The girl was pulling a small piece of paper from her backpack, stuffing it quickly into a drawer before turning off the light. Marissa backed away quietly, sensing her daughter needed space. The backpack lay slightly tilted on the living room sofa, the zipper partially open. As Marissa bent to tuck in a notebook, a few crumpled notes slipped out. On the white paper were smudged ink lines, childlike in handwriting but sharp in cruelty. Your mom really knows how to get attention. She stood like a statue, probably practiced it. Zora's just like her, always pretending to be something. Each word was a dull blade dragging across the mind. Not cruel in the way adults often are, but the careless mockery of children, which somehow cuts deeper. Marissa gathered the papers, folded them neatly, and returned them to Zora's bag as if untouched. Her hand trembled slightly, but her eyes remained composed. She didn't rush to confront her daughter. A mother's instinct told her Zora had seen the notes, had read them, and had chosen silence. The kind she'd learned from her mother, to watch quietly, to grow silently. In her bedroom, Marissa sat in front of the mirror. The light through the window cast a soft glow across the glass. Reflected was a woman in a wrinkled suit, collar darkened with sweat, hair bun sagging after a day stretched thin. But what made her pause wasn't the fatigue, it was her eyes. The eyes of someone who had survived too many losses, now asking, "Am I protecting my child?" The memory of Roman, her late husband, her anchor, washed over her in a quiet wave. The day he returned home beneath a folded flag, she had nearly left the agency. She'd envisioned a simpler life, free from the cost of sleepless nights, suspicion-filled stares, and mornings where her daughter woke to an empty kitchen. But she had stayed, because her daughter needed to see that her mother didn't just survive but had a reason to continue. The door creaked open. Zora peeked in, eyes cautious. She didn't ask anything, just walked over, sat beside her mother, and leaned her head on her shoulder. "You saw the notes, didn't you?" Zora's voice was quiet but steady. Marissa nodded. "Are you okay?" she asked, running her hand gently through her daughter's hair. Zora nodded again. No tears, no shaking. Her eyes still held their shine, resilient, like a young tree that had bent through a hard wind but stood taller for it. "I saw you face a gun and not flinch," she said. "When that video went viral, some kids said I should be proud. Then others started making fun. I got sad, but then I thought, if you had lowered your head in front of that gun, that's when I'd be ashamed." Marissa turned to her, chest tightening, not from hurt, but from a sudden, fierce sense of connection, of being comforted by the very person she always tried to protect. Zora lifted her chin, her voice firm. "I love you, not because you're strong. I love you because you're unshaken, and I want to be like you, not letting other people's words shrink me." In the quiet of the room, with only the soft hum of the AC weaving through the curtain folds, Marissa wrapped her arms around her daughter. The doubts, the online cruelty, the clickbait narratives, all of it faded in that moment, because here was the truth. This child was the legacy she had fought to preserve. Zora hadn't broken. And in her gaze, Marissa realized the fight was no longer just for personal dignity, but for every child like Zora learning how to stand tall in the face of ridicule. Marissa's sorrow transformed into resolve. She would keep going, not out of revenge, but to pass on the conviction that a black woman can carry her dignity forward, even when the world would rather see her fall. Zora looked up at her mother and smiled. "Tomorrow, I'm putting up a new note on my locker." "What's it going to say?" Marissa asked. "My mom's not performing. She's teaching me how to live right." Marissa smiled, for the first time in 3 days. No declarations needed. She had all the reason she would ever need to keep fighting. On the front door of the East Spartanburg Community Center hung a simple chalk-written sign. Open dialogue. No cameras, no media, no slogans. Inside the old tiled hall, fluorescent light spilled down onto a circle of wooden chairs. There was no podium, no colorful banners, no booming catchphrases. Marissa stood in the center of it all, hands resting lightly on the back of a chair, her expression calm, her gaze focused, as if she'd been listening even before anyone spoke. She had called for this gathering herself, turning down every offer for national television appearances. Once, she believed the media could expose injustice, but recent days have taught her something else. Truth doesn't need a microphone to echo. It needs a heart to hold it. And the place she chose to begin was here, among those harmed not for breaking laws but for daring to live beyond the expectations of those in uniform. The wall clock chimed twice, and by then every seat was filled. Elderly folks, teenagers, single mothers with infants in their laps. They hadn't come because they believed she could change their lives overnight, but because, for the first time, a high-ranking agent wanted to sit among them instead of above them, to listen instead of lead. An older woman with graying hair and a cane slowly stood. Her voice trembled, but her eyes held an unexpected brightness. "That same officer pushed me down once. I only asked for directions. Didn't step aside fast enough. My cane fell. My knee was bruised for a week. I filed a report. It went nowhere. Marissa looked up. The woman's quiet testimony carved itself into her memory, not because of paperwork, but because of truth. 3 chairs away, a young man in a sea blue hoodie nodded, then spoke. I got searched 3 times in 1 month. The only reason? I had a backpack and walked slowly. They asked what I had. I said food and college textbooks. They laughed. Said, "Really? A black college student?" He paused, then looked directly at Marissa. "I know you didn't do that to me, and I'm not asking you to apologize for a whole damn system. We didn't come here for apologies. We came to ask you to lead." Marissa felt her throat tighten. Lead. 2 syllables heavy with burden, but also with purpose. In that moment, she knew everything she'd done up to now hadn't been in vain. The room deepened in stillness, each word peeling back layers of memory. From the far side of the circle, a Latina woman in her 30s raised her hand, then slowly stood. Dressed in a plain white shirt, she opened her mouth to speak aloud but instead sat back down, whispering just loud enough for those near her. "I used to believe in the police, so much so that when my son came home late, I told him to be thankful, that there were good people out there. But then my son lost his job for reporting a coworker who took bribes. No one defended him. They forced him to resign. And after that, I don't know what to teach him anymore." No one interrupted. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the silence of people who knew too well what it felt like to be ignored, to live on the margins of rules made for someone else's protection. Marissa nodded, her eyes wet but steady. She stood, not stepping into the center, not raising her voice. "I once believed I could change the system from within, but I've learned this system doesn't wait to be changed. It demands that people like us stand beside each other so it doesn't consume us whole." She walked to the Latina woman, bent slightly, and whispered, "I'll help your son, and if we have to, we'll bring that case to where it needs to go." She turned back to the room. "I didn't come with speeches or policy plans. I came to listen, to understand, and to stand with you. I felt a gun at my head, but what I remember more is the silence around me. Today, I heard voices, and I will defend each of them with my rank, with my title, and if I must, with the rest of my life." Applause followed. Not thunderous, not explosive, just steady enough to ripple through the room like a shared heartbeat. That night, no one recorded anything, but something had been recorded in the hearts of those present, and Marissa, after years of enforcing the law, had finally begun the work of walking alongside it. Moments after the final applause of the community meeting faded from her chest like an aftershock, Marissa received an internal email from the Department of Justice. The subject line was short and sharp, like a blade laid gently on glass. Advisory on public statements. The body was no longer than a single paragraph, yet every word had been carefully chosen. Equal parts polite suggestion and veiled warning. Given the current climate of heightened social tension, statements representing federal agencies should be reviewed with discretion. We advise refraining from public commentary during the internal review process to avoid potentially negative impact on the image of law enforcement. Marissa sat still before her computer screen. The email didn't scream or threaten, but it squeezed her like a silk-gloved hand slowly closing around her throat. Less than an hour later, a call came through from a trusted advisor at the DEA, someone who'd stood beside her during cartel investigations along the western border. His voice was hushed, barely above a whisper, like he feared someone was listening. "You know I respect you, but think carefully. Silence right now means you keep your position, and it protects your daughter." He paused, sighed. "They've started digging. Things that were previously overlooked will resurface if you keep pushing." Marissa leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Every word he said was strategic, practical, and, in another life, maybe even wise. but on her desk lay another folder, already open, containing the report she'd quietly commissioned from an independent internal review team 2 weeks earlier. The findings sent a chill down her spine. Over the past 3 years, Black residents in Spartanburg had been stopped and arrested at a rate 3.2 times higher than white residents, despite similar crime rates across both groups. Particularly alarming were the arrests labeled as suspicious behavior stops. With no follow-up evidence, 84% of those involved were Black, primarily men aged 18 to 35. More than 30% of the incidents lacked complete paperwork or had police dashcam footage lost due to signal failure. Marissa flipped to the final page. A quiet footnote, like a whisper in a dark room. Among officers linked to these incidents, the name Carter Reddick appears most frequently. Then, as if twisting the knife, her phone buzzed again. A new viral post. An anonymous account had shared a photo of the gas station with a bitter caption. Some people stand still well. Others just perform well. The comments followed swiftly. DEA hero lady trying too hard. One post included what appeared to be a screenshot from Reddick's old profile, showing a picture of Marissa beside Gavin Mercer, with a note, "I've seen those faces. Big badges, but eyes that never face the truth." The source was unconfirmed, but the damage hit its mark, her honor. This time, the attacks came from 3 fronts. The very system she fought to protect, the man who once pointed a gun at her, and now from those who mistook her silence for surrender. Marissa stepped onto her balcony, gazing down at the streetlights flickering on. Below, life went on, cars flowing, neon blinking, people moving as if no one was being backed into a corner above. Zora was in her room, headphones on, head bobbing to study rhythms, jotting notes now and then. Marissa thought of what her daughter had said the night before. "I don't need you to dodge danger. I just need you not to let fear win." An invisible scale rose in her mind. One side, personal safety, her rank, income, ability to protect Zora. The other, the truth, and the knowledge that if she stayed silent now, people like the woman with the cane, the young Black man, the boy who lost his father for speaking out, would remain unheard. She considered resigning. She thought of fading into the background, working in silence. But then came a feeling stronger than fear. The shame of looking in the mirror and no longer recognizing herself. Marissa returned to her desk, opened her laptop, and typed the first line of a formal response. "I request an official investigation into systemic racial bias within the Spartanburg Police Department." Attached, arrest rate data and community-sourced documentation. She hit save, then opened another folder labeled Internal Media Contacts. The first name was a journalist who had lost her credentials for exposing cover-ups in the Houston police force, now leading an independent news platform. Marissa's eyes sharpened with resolve. Keeping her title might preserve her resume, but only action would preserve her integrity. The morning after Marissa submitted her official request for an investigation, complete with attached data, to the Office of the Independent Inspector General, she sensed something shifting in the air. There were no warnings, no email acknowledgments, not even the usual automated response. Just silence, abnormally long and heavy. By the third day, a letter was sent directly to DEA headquarters, labeled as an internal report. One phrase, printed squarely on the page, made Marissa freeze. "The case has been sealed. At this time, no clear grounds for investigation have been identified." Italicized, centered on the page, the line tried to bury its retreat behind bureaucratic phrasing. But to someone like her, who'd lived long enough in the machine, every word reeked of compromise and cowardice. Marissa didn't feel angry, not in the usual way. Instead, a coldness spread through her fingers, the kind of chill that comes when you realize the last line of defense you once believed in just stepped back, letting you fall. That night, she received a text message from an unknown number. No name, no profile picture, just 4 words. You should know better. A second message followed, shorter but sharper, like a scalpel slicing through the skin of experience. Reddick's not the only one. Marissa didn't move. The room was lit, but a shadow seemed to settle over everything. The steady whirl of the fan, the half-finished case files, they all seemed frozen, while those words burrowed deeper than any overt threat. She immediately activated her phone's security protocol, encrypting all personal data, and began tracing access logs from the agency's internal surveillance system. Not long after, using a network monitoring tool she had once personally pushed to implement, Marissa discovered something that hit like a punch to the gut. All correspondence between her and the independent analysis team had been copied into another account belonging to Agent Jordan Ellis. Ellis, the one who'd stood by her in complex operations across the Southeast, the one she had handpicked to join the technical analysis team after trauma had sidelined him from field duty. That man had taken everything she'd compiled about Reddick, about systemic bias, and handed it over to the very side she once thought was hers. What hurt wasn't betrayal. It was the fact that she had trusted right, and that trust was sold out for whatever scraps the system threw to those willing to bite. Marissa stepped into the hallway and called the head of internal security. Her voice was calm, each word sharp like hammer strikes on a crumbling wall. Effective immediately. I want Jordan Ellis's access revoked and his monitoring logs transferred to the independent review team. Also, I need the name of whoever authorized sealing the case before a formal review was completed. The line was silent for a few seconds, then a man's voice replied, reluctant, "I'll comply, Deputy Director Holt, but you should prepare yourself. There's more than one person who thinks you're stirring the waters." "Then, tell them," Marissa said, "I'm not stirring the water. I'm holding up a mirror." She hung up and walked to the bedroom, where Zora was curled up by the window, reading. Her daughter's eyes were still peaceful, but Marissa knew the window of safety was closing. The anonymous message hadn't targeted her. It was aimed at the one person she loved more than life. Minutes later, their things were packed. Zora, obedient as ever, quietly gathered her books. Her black backpack now lay beside a suitcase. Marissa didn't tell her they were being watched. She simply said they'd stay with her aunt for a few days for a change of scenery. Zora nodded, clutching her worn teddy bear. At the door, she paused and looked back at the house. "Are we coming back?" she asked. Marissa squeezed her hand. "We will, but when we do, I want you to see a place that isn't a shadow of power, but a place where justice is called by its name." The car rolled into the night, headlights carving a path through the darkness. Inside Marissa, the fire of rage had cooled. What remained was a blade, forged cold, honed by disappointment. When the Inspector General's office turned its back, Marissa chose a different path. She sat in the green room of a national news network, fluorescent lights above reflecting off the polished glass table in front of her. On her wrist was a thin metal bracelet, Roman's last gift before he left for his final deployment. It had never left her hand, just like her belief had never left her cause. Truth doesn't speak for itself unless someone dares to raise their voice in the middle of the noise. Behind that door was the main set of a nightly current affairs show watched by millions. The host was a journalist known for dismantling an entire city's police force through a years-long investigation. So, his invitation was a double-edged sword. It could make Marissa a national symbol of courage, or throw her into a storm too fierce to retreat from. She accepted, because what was happening had moved beyond personal reputation, and because silence, even when meant to ensure safety, only feeds something more dangerous than Reddick: complicity. A producer stepped in to give her one last chance. 3 minutes to air. We can pivot. Just talk about the gas station incident. Keep it soft. Marissa shook her head. I came here to open what's been sealed. A wound only heals when exposed." As the cameras lit up, the studio transformed into a battlefield of light. The host began with a short video, footage of the gas station, Reddick's gun drawn, and Maurice's astonishing calm as she laid her hands on the hood. "Deputy Administrator Marisa Holt," he began, "today the nation knows you through a viral clip, but we understand you're here to talk about more than just yourself?" Marisa nodded, locking eyes with the camera like she was speaking directly to every living room in America. "I'm here to speak about the numbers the cameras never catch, and about the networks real justice never seems to reach." She lifted the first page of the file before her, held it up for the audience. "This is an internal breakdown of Spartanburg police activity over the past 3 years. Black individuals are 3 times more likely to be stopped, searched, and arrested than white individuals, despite no significant difference in felony offense rates." She flipped to the next page. "These are complaints that were closed without investigation. 4 of them involve injured women, all black. 1 lost a pregnancy. 2 suffered broken arms. The officer named most frequently, Carter Reddick." The studio went silent. The host leaned forward, eyes sharpening. "Are you implying something here?" Marisa didn't hesitate. "I'm not implying. I'm stating it outright. Men like Reddick don't act with such impunity unless they're protected. And I have evidence of political shielding, from a state senator who intervened to shut down litigation involving one of Reddick's victims." Behind her, a graphic appeared on the screen, an email thread between a local attorney's office and a legislative aide. Subject, regarding Officer R, final line, "The senator would appreciate it if this matter could close itself without further paperwork." The host exhaled slowly, voice lowering. "You know this puts you in danger?" "Danger," Marisa said, "is knowing the truth and choosing silence to keep a title, a paycheck, or temporary peace. If I stay quiet, the truth dies with me, and girls like my daughter grow up believing the system can never be repaired." At that moment, in the network's control room, another clip began rolling across every social media platform, scheduled and preloaded by Marisa herself. It didn't replay the gun incident. Instead, it chronicled her 3-week journey collecting data, unanswered emails, graphs showing racial bias in the facial recognition system used by the local police, the same system that flagged her vehicle that day. Her voice narrated, "This isn't a personal story. It's a structural failure guarded by fear and powered by privilege." As the video aired, social media erupted, but this time, attention didn't focus on her expression or poise during the standoff. The public shifted from empathy to action. The Department of Justice, mid-preparation for a press conference to ease tensions, was blindsided. Reporters redirected their questions away from the gas station and toward the data Marisa had released. Civil rights groups called for a congressional hearing. A conservative white state senator, long a denier of racial bias, was forced to address the growing outcry from his own constituents. As Marisa exited the network that night, a wall of microphones awaited her. She smiled softly and walked past. Nothing more needed saying. What had to be said, she had already delivered, through documents, calm clarity, and the belief that truth echoes louder than any shout. In the passenger seat of her car, her phone lit up with notifications. One caught her eye, a message from Elena Vargas, her former field agent. The text read, "There's something you need to see. Meet me tomorrow. It's about Reddick and the system you're up against." Marisa looked up at the night sky over Spartanburg. She understood. The real battle was only just beginning. Elena's message had only 11 words, but it kept Marisa awake nearly the entire night. They met the next day at a cafe tucked behind a row of aging warehouses in Spartanburg's industrial belt, where truck engines blended with wind and streetlights hid beneath the tangle of trees. Elena had arrived early, sitting at the last table in the corner, baseball cap low, her face almost swallowed by the collar of a thick black jacket. But her eyes, those same sharp, steady eyes Marisa had seen at the gas station during the worst moment, were clear and burning. Marisa sat down without pleasantries. Elena didn't need them. Instead, she reached into her bag and placed a small metal hard drive on the table like an indictment no court had yet dared to hear. Inside is internal surveillance data from 6 South Carolina police departments. Elena began, her voice low and even. Emails, complaints, tampered reports, audio recordings between officers and regional command. Marisa tilted her head. "How did you get this?" Elena pressed her lips together, studying Marisa's eyes like she was testing whether this woman could bear hearing the rest. "I'm an inside operative for a group called Apex, unaffiliated with the DEA, the FBI, NSA. They're made up of people who lost family to police violence or who've seen too much silence in the system to stay outside it. They contacted me 3 years ago after I started noticing that reports I filed would disappear from the system without explanation." Elena leaned back, her eyes still on the untouched cup of coffee. "Reddick's been my target for a long time. He was involved in a fatal chase. The victim was a 17-year-old black kid, unarmed. The report said self-defense, but Apex has the radio recording. He ran because he knew he was wrong. Not letting some punk teach me a lesson on the street." She paused, her voice tightening. "The boy's name was Malik. I was first on scene, but they only let me write 2 lines, then transferred me out." Marisa said nothing for a long time. She knew that pain. The pain of standing over a body with every fiber in you screaming something wrong happened, while the entire system only cared about what would fit into the 6 o'clock news cycle. Elena pushed the drive across the table. "I tracked Reddick, not because he's just a bad cop. He's the living proof of a network that protects racial violence. But I've never seen anyone speak up the way you have. Apex calls you the door opener, because when you went on television, you did what so many of us in the shadows wished we could." Marisa gripped the drive. The cold of the metal reached up her spine. She knew the value of this object, but also the cost of holding it. "If I use this, will it trace back to you?" Elena shook her head. "We've got layers. Consider this a map. How you move through it, that's your call." They sat in silence for a while. Outside, wind rustled the palms against the glass. Marisa stared at Elena, a young woman who once worked field cases under her command, now revealed as a silent warrior who'd spent years swimming through the dark currents of an invisible war. "You know why I trust you?" Elena said, her voice wavering. "Because in that gas station clip, when you turned around and placed your hands on the car, you didn't yell, you didn't curse, you didn't bow. I saw that look, the look of someone ready, if that was her last day." Marisa placed her hand over the drive and nodded. "And I know," Elena added, "when someone like you refuses to bow, the whole system begins to tremble." They parted right there. No hug, no handshake, just a silent nod, thick with meaning. Elena walked away, vanishing into the thick shadows of the back lot. Marisa returned to her car, the hard drive now a weight that felt like a new limb. Back at her sister's house, she placed it on the table, opened her laptop. As the screen lit up, the blue glow cast across her face, the face of a woman who had just been handed a sword. From this moment forward, her every step would no longer be defensive. It would be a calculated assault. The moment the hard drive was fully encrypted, Marisa didn't wait another hour. She sent 2 copies, one to the Department of Justice, the other to a special division of the Department of Homeland Security. Each route was carefully chosen, each step overseen by her own hand. Rather than using the DEA's internal network, she routed the files through an independent reporting system run by cybersecurity experts who had once exposed data manipulation in the Baltimore lawsuit 3 years earlier. Marisa knew To bring down a system, you had to light the fire from where the cracks already ran. 2 days later, movement began. The DOJ announced the formation of a federal investigative unit tasked with reviewing the submitted files and internal records, citing credible information from within the law enforcement community. An emergency suspension order was issued for Officer Carter Reddick. His badge, his weapon, and all access credentials were revoked that same day. No more conference room handshakes in his name, no more nods in the cafeteria. The name Reddick, once whispered in fear, was now nothing more than an empty shell of a system about to implode. A special prosecutor was also dispatched to Spartanburg, a man known for dismantling corruption in New Orleans PD and for never missing even the smallest anomaly. On arrival, he demanded a 10-year audit of all undocumented arrests, enough to make former HR chiefs sweat through spring. The public responded not with outrage this time, but with testimony. They didn't just march, they filed affidavits, joined hearings, submitted official complaints. Each story, shared by ordinary citizens, became a blade, cutting through the armor of false morality built by Reddick and others like him. Through it all, Marissa did not return to the public eye. She stepped back, not to retreat, but to orchestrate. A spare room at her sister's house became her tactical command center. The walls were covered with whiteboards mapping every officer tied to buried cases. Every red line drawn connected a victim preparing to testify. Marissa trained them on how to document, how to tell their story, how to stand without shaking. She stepped behind the curtain so that every voice long silenced could now speak with force. Elena's hard drive became a torch. Inside it were lists of cases dismissed without due process, emails dodging accountability, audio recordings of officers saying things like, "Lose the evidence." No point making noise for those people. Justice didn't roar in. It advanced, steadily and precisely, carried by the hands of a DEA veteran who knew how to strike without spectacle. Marissa used not slogans but structure, not speeches but strategic dismantling. One by one, the wrongfully arrested took the stand. Among them was Angela Knox, the woman who lost her baby after being shoved by Reddick during an arbitrary arrest. She'd never imagined telling her story, until Marissa quietly said to her, "You don't have to believe me. You just have to believe your story matters." Not long after, a national newspaper published a full-page exposé titled, "The System Didn't Break from a Bullet. It Broke Because Someone Inside Was Brave." A quote from an anonymous source read, "She didn't scream to become the center. She cleared the board and turned pawns into kings." Gavin Mercer, the federal tactical chief who had stood beside her at the gas station, secretly sent her a sealed file detailing how commanders manipulated numbers by closing cases prematurely or labeling misconduct as non-threatening to avoid litigation. Marissa compiled it all, not to attack, but to equip. She passed it to civil rights organizations and independent legal teams. She knew the truth, when given to the right hands, was more powerful than any televised speech. In a rare, quiet moment, Zora sat beside her mother, coloring a new drawing. With confident strokes, the child shaded in a woman in a black suit, standing before a crowd, respected not for her title, but because she alone refused to bow. "Mom, do you think things are really changing?" Zora asked. Marissa brushed a hand gently through her daughter's hair and looked out the window. "They're not changing," she said. "We're making them change." Nearly 2 months had passed since her live interview, and Spartanburg was shifting, slowly but palpably, under the weight of public pressure and mounting investigations. But the atmosphere didn't truly break until the indictment against Carter Reddick was officially announced. For the first time in years, a local officer was not only held accountable in administrative terms but was being criminally charged. And this time, his name would not vanish from the records like it had before. The charges stacked like cinder blocks crashing into a still pond: abuse of authority, unlawful use of force, violation of civil rights, unlawful detention, and obstruction of internal investigation. A public trial was scheduled. Most strikingly, 3 former victims, who had previously refused all requests to testify, now agreed to take the stand. Among them was Angela Knox, the woman who had lost her pregnancy after Reddick shoved her during an arbitrary arrest. For 5 years, she had lived in fear of being fired from her job as a prison nurse. Anytime someone brought up what happened, she turned away like she'd never heard it. But when the clip of Marisa being held at gunpoint resurfaced in a new investigative special, Angela's eyes lingered a little longer. On a rainy afternoon, in a legal aid room linked to the prosecutor's office, she signed her name to a statement, hands trembling, tears slipping down the corner of her mouth. Angela had told her lawyer, "I don't believe the system will protect me, but I believe that woman. She stood alone. Why can't I?" Marisa had been the one to hand her the clip. No cameras, no spotlight, just a small room, a scuffed table, and the steady gaze of 2 women who had both been pushed into silence. "You don't need to trust the court," Marisa told her. "You just need to trust the voice you've kept buried inside." Angela nodded and signed. The prosecution of Reddick became a defining moment in the local movement against police abuse. Departments across the state began re-examining old records. Civilian oversight committees were formed in 3 neighboring cities. More importantly, the community began to realize the strength of truth when it was protected by strategy, not by unfocused rage. But the wave didn't stop there. As federal prosecutors dug deeper into the evidence Marisa had provided, they uncovered a series of encrypted emails, documents that pointed beyond mere misconduct cover-ups. Several messages had altered timestamps, and the sender's credentials traced back to high-level state government. Senator Richard Alton, the same man who had once praised Reddick at a 2018 swearing-in ceremony as the guardian of white rural order. Investigators widened the scope. Financial audits were launched into 3 tech contractors who had supplied facial recognition software and camera systems used disproportionately in black neighborhoods. Alton's name surfaced again, this time as an unpaid strategic advisor to one of the firms. Commissions flowed into a fund titled Southbound Community Alliance, publicly registered as a youth nonprofit, but in reality, nothing more than a hollow website and an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. More officers tied to Reddick-era cases began surfacing in subpoenas. One deputy chief, who had helped bury incident reports, abruptly filed for early retirement, but was detained before his pension paperwork could be processed. Another officer, who had accidentally lost body cam footage from Angela Knox's arrest, had all personal electronics seized for forensic review. Newly appointed DOJ internal investigators began working with the Senate Ethics Committee to build a case under charges of federal obstruction and collusion in organized abuse of power. Senator Alton could no longer avoid being summoned as a witness, but within days, several of his former staffers began cooperating in exchange for prosecutorial immunity. One former staffer testified that the senator himself had once called the Spartanburg police chief to handle it internally, keeping it away from the press after a 2020 incident where a Haitian teenager was stopped mid-street for riding his bike in the wrong lane. The teen ended up with 2 broken ribs, though the official report claimed injury sustained during restraint of resisting suspect. This time, no one needed to call for protests. The community had learned exactly where and how to strike, and now that blow was landing squarely at the top of the system. News headlines read in unison: "Gatekeeper of Justice" or "Architect of Privilege." Next to the images of Marisa and Angela stood a photo of Senator Alton exiting the courthouse, head bowed in a storm of press microphones. Even right-wing outlets that had once criticized Marisa for being too forceful now pivoted, demanding full investigation. The truth, once delivered with hard data and unshakable logic, left no room for political obfuscation. At an emergency hearing in the state Senate, a young Asian American senator, formerly a law student in Boston who had followed Marisa's story closely, spoke plainly. "We are not prosecuting out of emotion. We are acting because we now have evidence that power was used in the wrong place, in the wrong way, and for the wrong reasons." At the same time, Marisa finalized a decision she had long been weighing. She submitted her resignation to the DEA. Her letter was short, but clear enough for her colleagues to understand. She was not stepping away because she had lost, but because she had completed part of the mission she came for. I once believed that working within the system was the best way to repair it, but eventually I realized sometimes to fix the roof, you have to step outside and see where it's rotten the most. No fanfare, no press conference, no farewell ceremony. Marisa left the DEA on a quiet Monday morning, carrying a small box of personal items. Among them, a photo of her and her late husband during their early federal years out west, and a drawing by Zora, a black woman standing strong in a crowd, flashlight in hand, eyes steady on what lay ahead. But her journey didn't end there. Just 1 week later, the Coalition for Clarity launched, a nonprofit founded by Marisa, built around two core goals: training communities to understand their legal rights and creating independent oversight of law enforcement. At their first meeting in a modest community center, over 30 people sat in a circle, from single mothers wrongfully detained to former Latinx officers who had left the force out of moral conflict. Marisa entered not in a suit, not wearing a badge, just a plain shirt, a whiteboard, and a strategic action plan. "We're going to learn how to record lawfully, how to ask the right questions, how to document every stop, every threat, every abuse correctly." Her voice was steady, and once those truths are documented, delivered, and preserved, no one can bury them beneath this system again. From Washington to Georgia, community coalitions began reaching out to partners. People asked her why she didn't return to politics, didn't run for office, didn't become the face of the movement. Marisa declined. She had stood in the center of the power storm once, and now she knew where real impact lived, in quiet justice, planted through small conversations, community training, and giving people the clarity they needed right when it mattered most. In a later interview, when asked what made her leave the DEA, Marisa offered just one sentence: "I nearly died because someone thought I didn't belong where I absolutely did. I resigned to make sure my daughter, and kids like her, never have to fear standing in the right place." The quote was printed across the cover of a major national magazine. But to Marisa, her real statement was written in action, when she stood at the front of a classroom, looking at people who had once been silenced by fear, and said to each of them, "If the system doesn't see you, then we learn how to hold the light for each other." Late afternoon light poured through the window panes of a modest classroom in East Spartanburg's community center. The old wooden desks had been wiped down with care. A newly mounted whiteboard caught glints of sun like a mirror. The chairs were mismatched, the walls not soundproof, but the air was thick with something undeniable. The quiet, rising momentum of something new, something young, something grounded. Marisa stood at the front of the class, sleeves of her dark blue shirt rolled to the elbow, white chalk steady in her hand. Among the faces taking notes with quiet intensity was a girl with tight curls tied high, wearing a plain white t-shirt, seated in the front row. Zora Holt. She raised her hand just as Marisa paused. Marisa gave a small nod. Zora stood, her eyes bright with something she seemed to have been holding for a long time. Her voice rang out, measured, firm, laced with a maturity that felt older than her years. At first, I thought my mom embarrassed me. I didn't get why she had to stir things up, why she couldn't just stay quiet like everyone else. But then I saw her alone in front of a gun. I saw her sitting in a room, listening to victims without interrupting, and I understood. She chose the hard thing, not the easy one. The room went still for a moment. Marissa looked at her daughter, eyes soft with a blend of pride and deep gratitude. A few of the younger attendees began to clap. Then the whole class followed, not because Zora was Marissa's daughter, but because her words spoke for them all, those once standing at the edges of a system, now learning to step into its center with knowledge and quiet resolve. News outlets reported on the opening day of the program, including a clip of Zora's speech. Within 3 days, over 500 youths from across the state registered for the Eyes on Justice program. Among them, high school students, pre-law majors, software technicians, and young adults once wrongfully convicted and later exonerated. Marissa didn't ride the media wave. Instead, she and her advisors spent long hours drafting a basic curriculum for civilian oversight: how to legally film, how to log officer badge numbers, how to file complaints that stick. She partnered with Black, Latinx, and Asian community groups to create multilingual toolkits. No one was to feel like an outsider while learning how to defend themselves with knowledge instead of fear. Marissa Holt's story isn't just a clash between a federal agent and a prejudiced cop. It's the journey of a black woman who dared to challenge the system, not with rage, but with facts, intellect, and unwavering resolve. From the gas station where a gun was drawn on her in broad daylight, to her decision to resign and launch an independent watchdog group, Marissa chose the harder path: to stand instead of bow, to lead instead of settle. She didn't replace justice. She helped her community learn how to hold on to it. And in doing so, she opened the door to a new generation, where her daughter, and hundreds of other young people, are learning that dignity doesn't come from a title, but from refusing to step back in the face of injustice. What about you? If it were you, would you choose the hard path, like Marissa did? If her story made you pause and reflect, like, share, and subscribe to help bring more voices of justice into the storm.